Henry Kissinger, Nobel laureate, former Secretary of State of the United States, author most recently of the book I have in my hands that you can see if you're watching on the Salem News Channel, Leadership, Six Studies in World Strategy. It is a remarkable book. I can't recommend it highly enough, especially at this moment in history for the English who are listening, and the Brits, the 160,000 conservatives, are going to pick a new prime minister to lead their country in a matter of weeks. Dr. Kissinger, thank you for joining me today, and congratulations on leadership.
Thank you. Good to talk to you.
Thank you. It is really great to be able to talk to you about Margaret Thatcher and the other leaders profiled in your book, especially at a moment when Great Britain is picking a new leader. What do you think is most important for those people choosing between Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Foreign Secretary, to take from leadership as they consider for whom to vote to be the next Prime Minister?
One, the ability to analyze a situation correctly in terms of its inherent trends and the decisions that have to be taken. Second, to form a judgment and of the direction by which to take the country from where it is to where it needs to be. Third, to find people, personnel to assist in this process and to help institutionalize it. And fourth, to get a society to follow on such a course.
Dr. Kissinger, I learned from the chapter on Thatcher, as I did on almost every page of Leadership, a new thing, many new things. I did not know about her press club speech in 1975, where she said that she had to turn away from pessimism. She was really intent on turning the West away from pessimism. And you also said of her that after Falklands and her steadfastness, quote, "We ceased to be a nation in retreat." Is that applicable to the United States right now, the need to do away with pessimism in the sense of being a nation in retreat?
I think it's one of our most important issues. It's not so much of being in retreat, but not having faith in ourselves to be able to master the many challenges that are now in front of us and which are now global and not just regional, as they were to some extent in the early period after the end of the Second World War.
Well, we are confronted, and you deal in the conclusion with the double-edged sword of technology. In fact, I think it's the most provocative part of a provocative book, where you talk about technology and what it does, and that it's having incredibly corrosive and some constructive habits on our minds encouraged by this new technology. And you ask the question, what risks being lost in this age dominated by the image? And you say erudition, learnedness, seriousness, and independent thinking, in a phrase, deep literacy. Do you want to try and explain to the audience, Dr. Kissinger, it's amazing concept that you have in here, what deep literacy is?
When knowledge was transmitted mostly in writing and in books, it was important to train minds that they would get to the deeper levels, and that the first that sometimes crosses one's mind may not be the most applicable and the most accurate one. And for that, you needed a kind of self-training, a kind of acquaintance with literacy that would deepen the thinking. In the contemporary period, most of information is transmitted visually. And a visual transmission evokes feelings and reactions, but it does not lead necessarily, and often it does not, to asking oneself or asking the society about the deeper implications of what is happening. So that more and more people and more political leaders are obsessed with the immediate reaction to what they're doing and not asking themselves, sufficiently or at all about where that leads to society and the world with which they're dealing.
I think this has got to become near universally read because I'm quoting Dr. Kissinger to himself now. Intense reading can help leaders cultivate the mental distance from external stimuli and personalities that sustains a sense of proportion. Skipping a little bit. More profoundly, books offer a reality that is reasonable, sequential, and orderly, a reality that can be mastered or at least managed by reflection and planning. To the extent our leaders aren't reading in a disciplined way, Dr. Kissinger, they're absorbing information, they're absorbing images, but they're not really disciplining their mind at all, are they?
No, they're thinking primarily on the impact of what they're seeing or on which they are active. And they don't sufficiently train their mind to get to the deeper level. And therefore, this is why I wrote this book, to show how significant leaders had to deal with the complexity of the world before them and the manageable qualities.
You know, Dr. Kissinger, when did you begin this book? It's epic. And I don't know how long you've been working on it. I know for a while, but it's really kind of a life's work, but it doesn't seem like it took you that long to do. Have you been at it for a long time?
Now, actually, writing it was about 2.5 years, but the experience on which it is based, of course, was accumulated over a lifetime.
I want to tell the audience, Konrad Adenauer, The Strategy of Humility, Charles de Gaulle, The Strategy of Will, Richard Nixon, The Strategy of Equilibrium, Anwar Sadat, The Strategy of Transcendence, Lee Kuan Yew, The Strategy of Excellence, and Margaret Thatcher, The Strategy of Conviction. And you can't put it down. And I'm just going to pick on a few things, Dr. Kissinger, as we move around. I want to go back to the conclusion on producing leaders. Charles Hill, the late great scholar and statesman of Yale, on the necessity of reading fiction by statesmen. And this is in one of the footnotes, and I stopped and underlined it and typed it out. Indispensable to the strategist who cannot, by the nature of the craft, know all the facts, considerations, and potential consequences of a situation at the time a decision must be made, ready or not. That is his prescription for reading fiction. I was unaware of it until I read Leadership. Have you made a habit of reading fiction your entire life as well?
I read a lot of fiction throughout my life. In the last decade or so, I've been reading some historical fiction rather than pure novels. But I think great writers like Tolstoy or any of the great writers, and it isn't just reading the novel, it is having a habit of life in which taking off a week occasionally to change your perspective by reading about complexities that don't present themselves automatically to you, and therefore getting into a habit of dealing with issues that you might otherwise have passed by and that are importantly being passed by now.
Do you think it develops an informed intuition about unanticipated situations so that the statesman is ready to deal, as well as anyone can be ready, with new circumstances, previously unanticipated crises?
Well, I think it does. And actually, Charlie Hill was a remarkable person. He was what they call an adjunct professor at Yale, but he had been an assistant to me, to George Schultz, to other senior people in our government, because they could always count to getting from him a perspective and a depth that they could not necessarily get they could not get through the routine of bureaucracy. And he became, at Yale, I think, the most influential professor of political science, because he gave something that people didn't encounter elsewhere. And so a lot of us used to stay in touch with this otherwise somewhat obscure professor of.
When you drop that footnote at the end, that insight was, in your eyes, important to require, you also write in the conclusion, and this is a caution to every parent as well as professor, quoting Dr. Kissinger, with screens in every home, entertainment is omnipresent and boredom a rarity. More substantively, injustice visualized is more visceral than injustice described. Television played a crucial role in the American civil rights movement. Yet the costs of television are substantial, privileging emotional display over self-command, changing the kinds of people and arguments that are taken seriously in public life. How, Dr. Kissinger?
How does it do that?
Yes.
It does it by telling you when you react purely emotionally, be based really on a very selfish perception of what you see, by telling you to take a moment and to get yourself into the habit so that you can respond to events in a manner that is significant about it for the future. Because as I said a few minutes ago, one of the tasks of a leader is to move the society from where it is to where there's never been, from the familiar to what has yet to be experienced. And to gain the inner strength to lead in this way cannot be acquired simply by emotional responses, which are themselves shaped through an analysis of reactions rather than of thinking.
Do you think, well, let me phrase, I want to approach this with Margaret Thatcher indirectly. The most poignant of many poignant observations in leadership, I think, is on page 340. You're talking about former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan of Great Britain, who, as an officer in World War I, sent minor sons over the top, and you conclude he would not have had the heart to conduct the battle of economic endurance Margaret Thatcher was now waging. So it takes a bit of hardness of heart to accomplish the turning towards where the nation needs to go. I think that's what you're saying, Dr. Kissinger.
That's what I'm saying. He said he agreed with the decisions that Margaret Thatcher had taken. But he also said that he had sent the fathers of these people that he was concerned about over the top in World War I. And so he would have had an emotional block to making a decision that he recognized that intellectually was important, which was to modernize the British coal industry, which had been the mainstay of its industry in the 19th century for the competitive world of the 20th century. And Margaret Thatcher was remote. I've looked for an adjective to think of because she was not unfeeling, but she had to look at what Britain needed in the future and ask for sacrifices at the moment.
Well, she had the ability to endure. I don't know how to sum that up, but you write that during Falklands, she wept at night over her British sailors who died, over her British Marines who were killed, but she never would allow the public to glimpse that, Dr. Kissinger.
Well, there was an occasion in which I'm describing, in which I had lunch with the Foreign Office and the various experts in the Foreign Office and former ministers were recommending certain concessions that Britain was supposed to make. So later in the day, I saw Margaret Thatcher, and I thought that these ideas of concessions had been generally accepted. And so I mentioned them. I asked her which of them she favored. Well, it turned out she didn't favor any of them. And she was so irate that I didn't even have the heart to tell her these were ideas I got from her subordinates.
Something on page 351 of Leadership, I had never known that Ronald Reagan said to Cap Weinberger, give Maggie everything she needs to get on with it. I mean, I thought I knew about the Falklands. I don't know who your researcher was to find that in the news of the United States Naval Institute on June 27th, 2012. I've never heard that before.
No, that's exactly what he did, because there was some dispute within our government that the State Department wanted to go towards normal negotiations, while Weinberger was prepared to stand by Thatcher. So the issue came to Reagan, and Reagan solved it in the simple-sounding way he often talked, but which actually showed a deep understanding. And he said, give her everything she wants, because that could only work if it succeeded. And it did.
The risk she took is so very well described in Leadership. For that alone, I would encourage everyone to buy then read this book, but everything else matters as well. I want to ask you about Peter Carrington. It's one of my side notes, Dr. Kissinger. I got pages and pages of notes. You call him, and I remember him vaguely, the quintessence of honor. He resigned because somebody had to take the fall for not seeing the Argentinian move on the Falklands. So he did. And he never complained. And he told you privately, there's no point in accepting responsibility if afterwards you whisper to your friends that you are not really responsible. Why is Peter Carrington the quintessence of honor?
Peter Carrington is a person that throughout my public life I admired, and I had the privilege of working with him on a number of occasions, and we became friends, close friends. Now, I mentioned this particular case. All his life, Peter Carrington had thought that the culmination of his life would be if he were made Foreign Secretary. And he was made Foreign Secretary finally. And during his first year of service, the Falkland crisis came up. And he had actually warned ahead of time that if the British withdrew the cruiser they had there, which symbolized their military commitment, that serious consequences would follow. But then, when the crisis actually came, he took the fall for himself as if he had been the chief proponent of what turned out to be the wrong policy. And I saw him quite often at that time, and he expressed, and at no point did he ever express second thoughts.
That is honorable. In the conclusion you write, is true leadership possible today? Are leaders coming forth with the character, intellect, and hardiness required to meet the challenges facing world order? Hardiness, I know what character is, and you describe it at length. Of course, we know what intellect is, and it's demonstrated, in fact, by the book. What is hardiness, Dr. Kissinger?
Leaders have to be strong enough to stick to their convictions, even if they imply difficult choices, even if they involve some pain, because this is one of the ways they can demonstrate to their people that great solutions are possible and give them the chance to live up to the best in themselves, which they might be not ready or not courageous enough at any moment.
At the beginning of the book, you talk about all these great leaders, Adenauer, de Gaulle, Nixon, and you go through all the things that combine them together. But at the end, you're looking forward at the conclusion of the book, and you're looking at particularly the war in Ukraine right now. And you write a historically creative solution would neutralize Ukraine under a guarantee from the great powers. And you cite the Treaty of London in 1839, when Belgium was guaranteed, its neutrality was guaranteed, which lasted for 75 years. Nicholas I signed off on that, the guy who's allegedly the definition of autocrat. Are you suggesting Putin is like...
No, but I think the solution, this would have been a creative solution at the beginning of the evolution of the Ukrainian issue. If at the beginning, it's when the Soviet Union broke up, if Ukraine had been made not as an outpost of one side or the other, but as a possible bridge for the two sides. That is now no longer possible. And by having missed that moment, now we're in a situation in which Russia has attacked a sovereign country that wanted to be part of the Western world. So the outcome has to be one in which the Western powers are not defeated. And now we have to. I don't think we should ever have got into that position.
Well, you write in the conclusion that we ought never to drive China and Russia together. We have done so, haven't we?
Well, yes. Now we're driving China and Russia together to considerable extent. Of course, Nixon, who was in a comfortable position of having two enemies to deal with in China and in Russia, decided to divide them and try to keep them divided. And that was the genius of his opening to China.
It was. You write at the end about Margaret Thatcher and U.S.-China relations that she had to give up in Hong Kong in exchange for an imperfect deal, but it lasted 50 years, and you are not an optimist about which way it's going. Are there any, do you suspect there are any agreements with China now concerning Taiwan that will restrain the present government of China?
I think there was an understanding that was reached, which was that China could assert that it wanted a one-China solution, but it could not pressure the United States to achieve it, and that the United States would show restraint in not recommending a two-power solution, so that there was some ambiguity in the phraseology. But if the Chinese attempt to solve the problem by force, then it cannot be, then the danger of war would become very great. But we should, our preference should be to avoid that situation, but also not to let Taiwan be taken over by force.
Dr. Kissinger, the very succinct summary of the conundrum in which the world finds itself is in your conclusion. The conundrum is whether two different concepts of national government can exist peacefully, even cooperatively, side by side. Each thinks itself exceptional, but differently. The United States acts on the premise that its values are universally applicable and will ultimately be adopted everywhere. China expects that its civilizational uniqueness and impressive economic performance will inspire other societies to show deference to its priorities. Both the United States' missionary impulse and China's sense of cultural preeminence imply a kind of subordination to the other. The two nations are impinging, partly by momentum, importantly by design, on what the other had heretofore considered its core interests. There is no final resolution. That's realism, as starkly put as possible, Dr. Kissinger. How does that impact American policymakers? How ought it to impact the Chinese policymakers?
The policymakers on both sides are facing an unprecedented situation in the world. That they now have a capacity to not only to destroy each other, to destroy civilization itself, the scope of the weapons, the power of the weapons, but even more the increasing knowledge one has acquired about the autonomy of institutions that can now be built makes a all-out conflict between high-tech countries suicidal. And this is a lesson that has to be taught and has to be understood before one drifts into a situation like the outbreak of World War One, in which none of the leaders at the conclusion would have ever made that decision if they had known what the world would look like at the end. We know what the world would look like. So we have now on both sides to understand this reality and therefore begin some discussion of how to prevent it. And we as Americans have, of course, not to let this drive us into pacifism, because we have to be strong in order to be able to implement this restraint.
I agree, Dr. Kissinger, but I am a pessimist after reading this. When you meditated at the end of the book about the distribution of destructive technologies being very far advanced, and you're talking primarily of cyber and artificial intelligence and a sort of automated world war, one that's a limited war becomes a nuclear one through unintended or uncontrollable escalation. The human element is almost going to be gone, and non-nation state actors are going to possess the ability to oblige confrontation. I mean, I'm reminded of the late Dr. Krautheimer saying the reason we've never been contacted by an advanced civilization is anyone who gets too advanced destroys itself.
Well, Krautheimer was a person I admired enormously and whom I met as frequently as I could learn from him.
Do you think his realism on this point is prophetic?
No. Realism, but it's you mean his perception of how very advanced civilizations have destroyed themselves?
Yes.
Was it prophetic? Yes, I do.
Oh.
I think.
You know, the ability to walk back from the destruction of World War II into an Eisenhower era of caution, it's not going to be possible again with automated intelligence, with artificial intelligence that is automatic. I don't know how we get out of this bind. Certainly we will need leaders, though. And I wanted to ask you, by the way.
The only way we can walk back from that is to have leaders like Eisenhower at various points in his career, but that was just the beginning of the problem. But to have leaders who are capable of being both strong and restrained, and not to permit the mechanism of their internal decision-making and the morale of the decision-making, drive them into irreversible actions which humanity will not be able to tolerate.
That is the precipice. Now, part of that requires meritocracy to produce leaders who can somehow dance on that cliff's edge. I remember at President Nixon's funeral, you said he stood on pinnacles that became precipice. Well, we are now on a precipice, actually, and we need a meritocracy. And a lot of your conclusion is devoted to the collapse of the American meritocracy. And maybe collapse is a little bit too strong. Right, that the civic patriotism that once lent prestige to public service appears to have been outflanked by an identity-based factionalism and a competing cosmopolitanism. In America, a growing number of college graduates aspire to become globe-trotting corporate executives or professional activists. One cannot escape the sense that something is amiss when the relationship between the leadership class and much of the public is defined by mutual hostility and suspicion. I can't pretend to know how to get out of that bind, Dr. Kissinger. Do you?
I cannot write a prescription that you can apply like a sort of a cookbook theory. But you have to hope that our people believe in their fundamental values, that in the process we will create standards that enable one to recognize great leaders when they emerge, which is not self-evident now.
It is not self-evident.
We cannot be resigned. It's the essence of leadership to believe in the possibility of what is necessary.
Well, I'm tempted to end there, but I have to ask you a few more things about our mutual friend. He was your colleague, and he was my boss, President Nixon. He was, quote, unshakably convinced of the basic legitimacy of the American way of life, particularly the opportunities for social mobility as his own life personified. Do you believe the American leadership class still believes, unshakably as President Nixon did, in the legitimacy of our way of life?
Not generally.
I agree. How do we get that back?
That is the duty of people who are concerned with this issue. In too many of the universities, these basic values are being defined as questionable and not as essential.
I agree. I want to close with this. I'm so glad you used Alan Bloom's translation of Plato's Republic, because this book reads in part like The Closing of the American Mind. You also used Harvey Mansfield and Delba Winthrop's de Tocqueville. You didn't use Harvey Mansfield, Nathan Tarkow's translation of Machiavelli's discourses. Side note, do you just use the translations that are handy, or do you have favorite translations?
No, I'm afraid I use handy translation.
Okay. And are you friendly with Harvey Mansfield? Were you on the faculty together at Harvard at the same time?
We were on the faculty together and we were friends.
So were you ever involved in the arguments by the students of Strauss about his legacy, Harvey on the East Coast, Harry Jaffa on the West Coast, or did you stay out of that argument?
No, I was not involved, but I'm afraid I have to end this.
Okay, I understand.
If you let me call you tomorrow, I'll tell you why.